I have buried 3 men with my own hands on this land, and none of them died the way you'd expect out here. Not from bullets, not from fever, not from the cold that comes down off the lava rock in November and doesn't leave till March. They died from waiting, from watching a woman defend a fence line alone because the county wouldn't send help and her neighbors wouldn't spare the trouble. I kept a ledger back then, still have it, water-stained and chewed soft at the corners, where I wrote down every debt owed and every debt paid on the Whitfield ranch. Most of what's in there isn't money. It's who stood by her and who looked away, and the one name I didn't write down for 2 years because I didn't believe he'd ever come back to collect what was his. I was wrong about that. I want to tell you how wrong and what it cost and what it gave back, because there are stories about this country that get told with the guns first and the grief last, and I've never trusted those. This isn't one of them. This is about a widow who wouldn't leave, a son the town tried to forget existed, and the 6 weeks in the fall of 1878 when I stopped believing the worst about people and started believing something harder to carry. That the worst and the best in a man can live in the same house, sometimes the same heart, and you don't get to choose which one shows up when it matters. Sit a while. I'll tell it the way I lived it, not the way it got told after. My name is Silas Broom, and before I go further I ought to confess my one vanity. I have kept a log of every season I worked the Whitfield spread, the way some men keep a Bible or a flask, because writing a thing down is the only way I've ever found to make sense of it after. I was 51 years old that autumn, half crippled in the left hip from a horse that rolled on me in '71, and I had exactly one skill left worth paying for. I could read cattle and I could read men, usually before either of them decided what they were going to do. It was the second skill that got me into trouble that year, because I read the men who came for Ellen Whitfield's ranch long before she let herself believe what I was reading. The Whitfield place sat in the high scrub country where California bleeds into Oregon, close enough to the lava beds that on clear mornings you could see the black rock shimmer like something still smoldering, though the war that made it famous had been over 5 years by then. Ellen's husband, Thomas, had bought the land cheap in '69, cheap, because most men wouldn't touch ground that close to where the Modoc had made their last stand, as if grief could poison soil the way alkali does. Thomas didn't care about that. He cared about water, and the spread had a spring that ran clean even in August, and that was worth more to a rancher than any story about ghosts. Thomas died in the spring of '76. Consumption, slow and mean, the kind that takes a big man and folds him down to something you can carry in your arms by the end. I was there the night he went. Ellen didn't cry where I could see her. She washed his face, and she wrote something in a book she kept hidden from everyone, and then she came out to the porch and told me the cattle still needed moving in the morning, storm or no storm, and I understood then what kind of woman I was going to be working for. She was 38 that fall of '78, silver already threading through hair the color of wet sand, with hands that had gone hard and cracked from rope and lye soap. She did not look like a woman anyone could bully. That was the trouble. Men who came to bully her expected tears, and when they got a flat stare and a steady voice instead, it made them meaner, the way a dog gets meaner when you don't flinch. The first of them came in September, riding a horse too fine for honest work, wearing a suit too clean for ranch country. His name was Garrett Voss, and he represented or claimed to represent a cattle syndicate out of Sacramento that wanted to consolidate grazing rights along the whole eastern slope. He had papers. Men like Voss always have papers. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard and did not get down, which I noted, because a man who won't dismount on your land is a man who's already decided he doesn't owe you courtesy. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, touching his hat with 2 fingers no more. "I've come to make you a generous offer." "I've had 3 generous offers this year," Ellen said. She was standing in the yard with a basket of wash on her hip, and she did not set it down, which I understood as its own kind of answer. All from men who didn't get down off their horses either. Voss smiled the way men like that smile, a smile that costs them nothing and promises less. The syndicate is prepared to pay $1,100 for the full parcel, water rights included. That's more than fair for unimproved range. It's improved, Ellen said. My husband improved it with 14 years of his life, and it's what's left of him I've got to hold on to, so no. I watched something shift behind Voss's eyes, not anger, not yet, calculation. The look of a man revising a number in his head, and not the offer. I'll leave the papers, he said, in case you reconsider before winter. He didn't leave papers. What he left 3 nights later was 40 head of Ellen's cattle scattered through a fence some coward had cut in 6 places, and 2 of the calves dead in the wash where they'd gone over rock in the dark trying to find a way back to water. I found them at dawn. I want you to understand what that looks like, because it isn't in the ledgers of men like Voss. A calf that's broken its forelegs on volcanic rock, still breathing, still trying to stand. Its mother standing over it bawling in a way that doesn't sound like an animal sound at all. It sounds like grief, plain grief, the same note a person makes. I had to shoot both calves myself. Ellen came out while I was doing it and she didn't say a word. She just stood there in her nightdress with a shawl pulled tight and watched, and after the second shot she turned around and walked back inside, and I heard the door close soft, which was worse than if she'd slammed it. That was the start of it. I logged it in my book that night, Sept 14. Fence cut west pasture, 2 calves lost, V responsible, no proof. I have always been careful in my logs to write only what I could prove, a habit that has cost me satisfaction more than once, because a man wants to write down what he believes, not only what he can defend. Word travels in cattle country the way fire travels in dry grass. You don't see it start, you just feel the heat arrive. Within a week, half the county knew the Whitfield place had been marked, and here is the ugly truth I have to tell you. Most of them did nothing, and some of them were glad. Ellen Whitfield had never been fully welcomed in that town, not the way a widow with land ought to be, because everyone knew, though almost no one said it plain to her face, that her boy, her only child, was half Modoc. His name was Isaac. Thomas had married Ellen's first husband's widow. No, I misspeak. Let me set it right, because I promised myself I'd tell this true. Ellen's first marriage, before Thomas, had been to a Modoc man named Charka, back when such marriages were rarer than rare and dangerous besides. In the years right before the war broke the tribe apart and scattered what was left of them to a reservation 200 miles north in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma, or into hiding, or into graves. Charka died at Lost River in November of 1872, in the very first skirmish of the war that would end at the lava beds the next spring, when soldiers came to move the Modoc band back onto land they'd already proven couldn't feed them. Ellen was widowed once already by the time she married Thomas Whitfield 2 years later, and she brought Isaac with her, a boy of 9 then, 13 when I first came to work the ranch, 17 the autumn I'm telling you about now. Isaac hadn't lived at the ranch in 2 years. That's a wound I'll open slow because it deserves care. When Thomas died, something in the county's tolerance died with him. Thomas had been well liked, a war veteran himself, and his standing had shielded the family more than anyone admitted. Within a year of the funeral, Isaac had taken to riding north for long stretches, then longer ones, until the stretches became most of the year, and I do not fully know, did not, that autumn, everything that had passed between mother and son to make him go. I knew only what Ellen let show, which was grief laid on top of grief, a woman who'd lost a husband and then watched her son choose absence, and who would not speak an unkind word about him to anyone, including herself. "He'll come back when he's ready," she told me once in August, before any of this trouble started, when I'd asked too plain a question about where the boy had got to. "He's not running from me, Silas. He's running from what this county thinks he owes it just for existing." I didn't understand that then the way I came to understand it. I do now. The trouble with Voss did not stop at cattle. 2 weeks after the fence, a man came to town. I never got a full name for him, only Hobbs. And I noted in my log that I didn't trust a man who offered only half of what he was called. And Hobbs began telling anyone who'd listen that the Whitfield land title was clouded, that Charka had held some claim to it under an old treaty allotment that made the whole deed unsound, that if the county pressed the matter, Ellen could lose the ranch to litigation and get nothing at all. Whereas the syndicate's offer, generous as it was, would at least put money in her hand before the courts stripped her bare. It was a lie built on a truth, which is the most dangerous kind. There had been an allotment once, years back, before Thomas ever bought the land, a scrap of paper from the Indian agent's office that nobody had ever acted on, that meant nothing in any court in California, but that sounded, to frightened ears, like exactly the kind of thing that could unmake a woman's whole life. Ellen understood the lie for what it was. She'd lived with that scrap of paper's history longer than anyone in the county. But understanding a lie doesn't stop it from doing its work on your neighbors, and by the first week of October, 3 of the ranch hands who'd worked seasonal for the Whitfields for years suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, and the feed store in town started finding excuses to run short of what Ellen ordered. And the marshal, a soft, unhurried man named Purdy, who I never once saw hurry for anything, told her, when she rode in to report the cut fence and the dead calves, that without a witness who'd swear to what he saw, there wasn't much the law could do. "I saw it," I told her that night. "I'll swear to it." "You saw the fence cut, Silas. You didn't see who held the wire cutters." She was right, and it near broke something in me to admit it, because I have never in my life felt so useless as I did watching a good woman get squeezed by men too careful to leave a fingerprint on their own cruelty. By the middle of October we were down to 4 hands total, counting me, to work near 600 head across open range, with winter coming on and the syndicate's patience, if you could call it that, running thinner every week. Voss came back twice more. The second time he didn't bother with courtesy at all. "There are ways this goes easy, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, still not dismounting, "and ways it goes hard. I'd hate for a woman alone to learn the hard way what happens to isolated property come winter, when help is thin on the ground, and the weather turns unkind to structures left unwatched." That was a threat to burn her out, plain as I've ever heard one dressed in a gentleman's voice, and Ellen heard it the same way I did. I watched her hands, which is a thing I do, a habit from reading men, and it turns out I read her the same way. Her hands were steady on the basket, steadier than mine would have been, but her knuckles had gone white. "Get off my land," she said. He tipped his hat and went, unhurried, and that unhurriedness was its own message. "I am not afraid of you, and I do not need to be." That night I sat up late with my ledger, and I wrote something I hadn't let myself write before. Oct. 19. She will lose this place if it's only us. 4 hands and a widow against men with money, and no shame is not a fight. It is a slow funeral. I stared at that line a long time before I blew out the lamp, because I did not like admitting defeat on paper any more than Ellen liked admitting fear out loud. But a log that lies to protect your feelings isn't worth keeping. I want to tell you what happened 3 days after that, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on, and I did not see it coming, though I should have, given how long I'd claimed to be a man who reads what's ahead. I was mending tack in the barn near dusk when I heard a horse come into the yard at a walk, not the hurried clatter of trouble, but slow, deliberate, the pace of something that had ridden a long way and knew it. I stepped out with my hand near my belt, which had become habit those weeks, and what I saw stopped me flat. A young man sat a lean gray horse in the yard, dust-caked from what must have been days of hard travel, wearing a mix of clothes I couldn't place at first glance. A cavalry surplus coat gone soft with wear, moccasins instead of boots, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a bow case slung alongside a rifle scabbard, the 2 weapons riding together like he saw no contradiction in carrying both. He had a face that held Ellen's jaw and someone else's eyes, dark, deep-set, watchful in a way that made the hair rise on my arms before I understood why. Ellen came around the corner of the house with a hand towel still in her fingers, and she stopped so sudden I heard the towel hit the dirt. "Isaac," she said, and her voice broke clean in half on the second syllable, and I understood, standing there useless with a bridle in my hands, that I was watching 2 years of silence arrive on a tired gray horse, and that whatever came next for the Whitfield ranch was not going to look anything like what had come before. He swung down slow, favoring his left side in a way that told me he was carrying an injury he didn't want remarked on, and for a long moment mother and son just stood there in the yard, 10 feet apart, neither one moving, the way two people do when they've rehearsed 100 different reunions in their heads, and none of the rehearsals fit the real thing. "I heard," Isaac said finally, and his voice was rougher than I expected, a young man's voice that had spent a long time not talking to anyone who mattered. "Word travels, even where I've been. I heard there's men circling this place like it's already dead." "Isaac, I should have come sooner." He looked at the fence line to the west, at the fresh-mended wire I'd strung with my own hands, at the dead grass where the calves had gone over rock, and something moved across his face that I would spend the next month learning to read grief and guilt, and underneath both of those, something harder settling into place like a bolt sliding home. "I'm not sooner," he said, "but I'm here now. And I don't intend to leave again." I stood in the barn doorway that evening with the light going gold, and then gray over the lava rock in the distance, watching a mother and a son who'd lost 2 years to something neither of them had explained to me yet, and I did what I always do when I don't know what else to do with what I'm feeling. I went and found my ledger, and by lamplight I wrote the only line that felt true enough to set down. Oct. 22. The boy came home. I don't know yet if that's good news or the start of worse trouble. Both, probably. It usually is. I had no notion, writing that, how right I'd turn out to be, or how much it would cost all 3 of us to find out. I'll tell you plain, I did not sleep well that first night with Isaac back on the ranch, and it wasn't fear that kept me up. It was the strange, unsettled feeling of watching a house rearrange itself around a person it hadn't held in 2 years. Ellen moved through her own kitchen that evening like she was relearning the floorboards. She set a plate for Isaac without thinking, and then stood there a moment too long, looking at it, like the simple act of feeding her son had become something she'd forgotten how to trust herself doing. Isaac ate like a man who hadn't eaten a full meal in days, which I noted and said nothing about. And when Ellen finally asked, gentle, careful, the way you'd ask a spooked horse to come closer, where he'd been these 2 years, he set his fork down and was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. "North," he said finally, "the reservation in the territory first. Some of our people ended up there after the war, what was left of us. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see who'd survived and how." He turned his cup slow between his hands, not drinking from it. "It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't home either. Just people trying to remember how to be a people on land that isn't theirs, told by an agent when they can plant and when they can't." He looked up at his mother. "Then I went back to the lava beds, to where my father died." Ellen's face didn't move, but her hands, folded in her lap, tightened until the knuckles showed pale. "I needed to stand there," Isaac said, softer now. "I needed to understand what he died defending and what it cost before I could decide what I was defending by coming back here. I'm sorry it took me 2 years to understand that. I'm not sorry I went. I want to be honest about something here, because it would be easy to tell you Isaac came home and everything mended smooth, and that isn't the truth of it. There was a rawness between mother and son that first week that I could feel in the room like a change in weather, not anger, nothing so simple as that, but the particular ache of 2 people who love each other and have both been carrying separate griefs alone for so long that they've forgotten the shape of grieving together. Ellen had built her strength around his absence. Isaac had built his around the belief that his presence only made things harder for her. Neither of those beliefs was going to unbuild itself in an evening. But he stayed. That was the thing that mattered most. That first week he stayed and he worked, and he watched everything with the same quiet, careful attention I'd noticed the day he rode in. He rode the fence line twice a day. He asked me, without a trace of false pride, to teach him what he'd forgotten of cattle work in his years away. And I found myself explaining things to a 17-year-old with more patience than I usually had for grown men who should have known better. And he asked questions about Voss. Careful, specific questions. How many times had he come? What had he said exactly? Who else worked for him? Had anyone seen him with the man called Hobbs? Did the marshal's office keep any record of the complaints? I began to understand that Isaac was not simply grieving and settling back into ranch life. He was building a case, the same patient way I built my ledger, except his questions had a different aim than mine ever had. "You're not planning to go around swinging fists at Voss," I said to him one evening, half a question, half a warning, as we sat mending a section of fence by lantern light after dark because daylight hours had gotten too thin to waste. Isaac didn't look up from the wire he was twisting. "No," he said, "fists lose to men who own the marshal's patience. I learned that watching what happened to my father's people. You don't beat men like Voss with anger. Anger's what they want. It gives them the excuse to bring in more men, worse men, and call it defense." He finally looked at me. "You beat them by making it cost more to stay than to leave. And how do you aim to do that?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, and there was something almost like relief in the admission, a young man not pretending to certainty he didn't have. "But I know the ground here better than Voss does. I know things about this land, about water, about the old boundary markers, about who actually holds what paper, that a syndicate man riding out from Sacramento never bothered to learn. Knowledge is the only weapon I've got that he doesn't." I logged that conversation in my book that night, and for the first time in weeks the entry didn't read like a record of loss. Oct. 29. The boy thinks different than most men his age. Patient. Watching for the seam in a thing before he pushes at it. Might be Ellen taught him that. Might be the 2 years taught him. Either way, I'm glad of it. The seam, when Isaac found it, was in the old allotment paper Hobbs had been using to spread doubt about the Whitfield title. Isaac rode 2 days to the county recorder's office in the seat town, and 2 more days to a mission school, where an old missionary named Father Ulrich had kept records of Modoc allotments going back before the war. Records nobody in Voss's syndicate had thought to check because they assumed, as men like that always assume, that no one on the losing side of history kept paper of their own. What Isaac found was this. The old allotment scrap Hobbs had been waving around wasn't a claim against the Whitfield land at all. It had been issued to a different Modoc family entirely, on a different section of ground 11 miles east, and it had lapsed and reverted to public domain a decade before Thomas Whitfield ever filed his deed. Hobbs had been trading on a resemblance of names and a county's willingness to believe the worst about Indian land claims without checking a single fact. It was, Isaac told us at the supper table, the flimsiest kind of lie. The kind that only works on people too afraid or too indifferent to ask a second question. "That doesn't stop Voss," Ellen said, and I heard the exhaustion under the words, the fear that a good piece of paper might not be enough against a bad man with money. "He'll find another lie if this one falls apart." "Maybe," Isaac said. "But a lie that falls apart in public costs him something. Word travels here the same as anywhere. If the whole county learns Hobbs was lying outright, folks start wondering what else the syndicate's been lying about. Men like Voss don't survive scrutiny. They survive silence." It was a good plan, and I want to tell you it worked clean and simple, but that isn't how that autumn went, and I promised I'd tell this true. Voss came back on the 2nd of November, and this time he brought 3 men with him, hired men, hard-faced, the kind who don't say much because their presence is the whole of what they're paid to say. He dismounted this time, which should have told me something worse was coming. Because a man who finally gets down off his horse has decided the pretense of courtesy isn't worth maintaining any longer. "I hear the boys come home," Voss said, looking past Ellen to where Isaac stood in the barn doorway. "I hear he's been asking questions in the county office, making noise about paperwork." "I hear you've been telling lies to my neighbors," Isaac said, walking forward slow, and I moved to stand near Ellen without quite deciding to, the way you move toward a fire without deciding to feel its heat first. "Careful," Voss said, and something in his voice had shed its Sacramento polish entirely. "A half-breed making accusations against a chartered syndicate is a dangerous game, boy. There are men in this county who'd be glad of an excuse to remind you and your kind you're tolerated here, not welcomed. I'd hate to see that reminder get delivered rough." The silence that followed had a weight to it I have never forgotten. I watched Isaac's hands that habit again, and I watched them stay open, stay loose at his sides, when every instinct in a younger, angrier man would have closed them into fists. It cost him something to do that. I could see it cost him. "You threatened my mother," Isaac said, quiet level. "You cut her fence. You killed 2 calves that never did you a wrong in their short lives. You told lies to men who ought to have known better, and you did all of it because you believed a widow and her half-Indian son wouldn't have the means or the standing to fight back." He took another step, close enough now that Voss's hired men shifted their weight, hands drifting near their belts. "I've spent 2 years learning what it costs a person to lose everything to men who believe they're owed whatever they want. I am done being quiet about what I've learned." "Is that a threat?" Voss asked, and there was something almost eager in it, like he wanted the excuse. "It's a fact," Isaac said. "The allotment paper Hobbs has been waving around belongs to a family 11 miles east and lapsed 9 years before my stepfather ever bought this ground. I have Father Ulrich's mission records to prove it, sworn and dated. I have a letter from the county recorder confirming the same. Tomorrow morning I ride into town and I make both of those public to the marshal, to the feed store, to every rancher who's been made afraid enough of a lie to stop selling my mother grain. You can ride out now with whatever's left of your reputation, or you can wait for morning and lose all of it in front of the whole county." I have thought many times since about that moment, about the particular kind of courage it takes for a young man to stand unarmed. For Isaac had left the rifle and bow both back near the porch, a choice I understood only later as deliberate, a refusal to let this become a fight settled by weapons, and offer his enemy a way to leave with something instead of nothing. It was not the choice of a man out for vengeance. It was the choice of a man who had learned, somewhere in 2 years of grief and reckoning, that winning ugly still costs you something you don't always get back. Voss did not answer right away. He looked at Isaac a long moment, and then at Ellen, and something calculating and cold moved behind his eyes, the look of a man deciding whether the fight was still worth the cost. "You've got until the marshal's office opens," he said finally. "Then it stops mattering what paper you've got." He mounted, and his men mounted, and they rode out at a pace that wasn't quite as unhurried as Voss's usual leaving, which told me something had shifted, even if the danger hadn't passed. That night none of us slept. I sat on the porch with my rifle across my knees, and near midnight Isaac came and sat beside me, and for a long while neither of us spoke. "You did right today," I told him eventually. "Harder thing, walking away from a fight than into one. Took more out of you than swinging would have." "It's not over," he said. "Men like Voss don't lose gracefully. He'll try something before morning, or he'll try something after, when the paperwork's cost him the county's trust, and he's got nothing left to lose by getting ugly about it." He looked out at the dark shape of the lava rock against the stars. "I keep thinking about my father. He tried the patient way too, at Lost River, before the shooting started, tried to talk, tried to hold his people together without giving the soldiers reason to move on them. It didn't save him. I don't know if patience ever really saves anybody out here. I just know it's the only thing I've got that doesn't make me into the kind of man Voss already thinks I am. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Not one that would have comforted a boy carrying his dead father's war on top of his own. I just sat with him, the two of us and the rifle and the dark, until the sky started going gray in the east, and I thought about my ledger, waiting inside on the kitchen table, and how some nights the truest entry a man can write is nothing at all, just silence, held between two people, because some things a page can't carry. The sun came up on the 3rd of November over a ranch that had not burned in the night, and none of us knew yet whether that was mercy or only a delay. We would find out before the day was through, and it would cost more than any of us, even Isaac, who'd already lost a father to men exactly like Voss, believed we had left to give. Isaac rode for town at first light, the mission records folded careful into an oilcloth pouch inside his coat, and Ellen wanted to ride with him and he wouldn't let her. "If this goes wrong," he told her, standing by his gray horse in the cold blue morning, "I need you here, not caught between me and whatever Voss decides to do about it." He looked at her a long moment, and something passed between them that I recognized even from a distance, not an argument settled, but a truce reached, the particular tenderness of two people who have hurt each other by trying too hard to protect one another. "I'll be back by midday." He wasn't. I want to tell that part slow, because it's the part that still sits hardest in my chest all these years later. Midday came and went with no sign of him on the road. Ellen tried to keep busy, mended what didn't need mending, checked water troughs that were already full, and I recognized the particular restlessness of a mother pretending calm for her own sake as much as anyone's. By 2 in the afternoon I saddled up to ride toward town myself, and that was when I smelled it, faint at first on the wind, then sharper. Smoke, coming from the direction of the north pasture, where we kept the hay barn stocked for winter feed. I have seen a lot in my years on this land, but I have never moved faster than I moved that afternoon, and even so I arrived too late to save the barn. It was already a column of orange and black against the pale sky, the heat of it pushing me back 30 feet before I'd even gotten close enough to try, and I understood in one sick, cold moment that this was Voss's answer, not to Isaac's threat directly, maybe, but to the fear of losing, delivered the only way a coward knows how to deliver anything. In the dark, against a building, where no one had to look him in the eye while he did it. Ellen arrived moments after me, and I will never forget the sound she made, not a scream, something quieter and worse, the sound of a woman watching a season's worth of hay, a winter's worth of survival for 600 head of cattle, go up into smoke that would leave nothing behind but char and ash and the particular smell of ruin that clings to a place for weeks afterward. We had no way to save it. We could only keep the fire from spreading to the house and the stock pens, and we fought that fight with wet sacks and shovels and every ounce of strength either of us had left, until well after dark, until the barn was nothing but a smoldering black skeleton against the stars and both of us were coughing smoke and standing in scorched grass too exhausted to speak. It was near 10 that night when Isaac finally rode in, and the look on his face when he saw the ruin of the barn told me he understood immediately what had happened, and why. And I watched something break and then reform in him all in the space of a few seconds, grief. Then a fury so controlled it was almost worse to witness than if he'd let it loose, and then, underneath both, a terrible steadiness. "I filed the records," he said, dismounting slow, his voice flat with exhaustion and something colder. "The marshal read them in front of half the county. Hobbs left town within the hour, didn't even wait for his horse to be reshod, just rode. The syndicate's man in Sacramento sent a wire disavowing the whole scheme the moment word got out, cutting Voss loose to save the company's name." He looked at the barn, at the black smoke still curling up thin against the night sky. "We won the paper fight. Voss just made sure it wouldn't feel like winning." Ellen crossed the yard and put her hand against her son's chest, over his heart, the way I imagined she must have done when he was small and frightened of something in the dark, and she didn't say anything at all. I have come to believe that was the truest thing she could have done. There was no comfort to be found in words for what had been lost that night, and she didn't try to invent any. Here is the decision I promised to tell you about, the one that sat heaviest on all of us in the days after, because Isaac knew, as we all did, exactly where to find Voss. He'd taken a room at the hotel in the county seat, waiting, we later learned, to see whether the fire had broken the Whitfields the way threats and lies hadn't. Isaac could have ridden in that night with his rifle and ended the whole business, the way men in these stories are so often expected to end things. I watched him consider it. I watched the weight of that choice move behind his eyes the same way it had the day Voss's men rode into the yard, and I did not know, standing there in the ash and the cold, which way he'd choose. If I go after him tonight, Isaac said, more to himself than to either of us, I become exactly what this county's afraid I already am. I make it easy for the next Voss, and the one after that, to say the Whitfield ranch is dangerous, that the boy's a killer that Ellen ought to have sold when she had the chance. I hand them the story they want. He looked at the barn's black ribs, still ticking as they cooled. Or I let the truth I filed today do the slower work. I let the county see him ride out in disgrace, instead of martyring him into something worse. That's a hard thing to ask of yourself, I said, the night your family loses a whole winter's feed to his match. It's the hardest thing I've asked of myself since I came home, Isaac admitted, and his voice cracked just slightly on the last word, the first crack I'd heard in him since he rode into the yard on that tired gray horse weeks before. But my father tried the fast way, the desperate way, when talk failed at Lost River, and it cost him everything and changed nothing for our people in the end but grief. I don't know that the slow way saves us either. I only know I'd rather lose a barn than lose the last of what makes me different from the men who burned it. He didn't ride after Voss that night or any night after. Voss left the county within the week, the syndicate's disgrace following him like smoke of its own, and whether he ever answered for the fire in any court I cannot tell you, because he didn't, not in any way the law recognized. One more small cruelty this story doesn't get to resolve clean, because life so rarely does. What I can tell you is what came after, because that's the part worth keeping. The county rebuilt some faith in the Whitfields that winter, slow and grudging as county faith tends to be. A few of the old hands came back, ashamed enough of their earlier absence to work twice as hard to make up for it. And even the feed store found its shortages mysteriously resolved once Hobbs's lies stopped shadowing every transaction. It wasn't enough to undo 2 years of Isaac's absence, or the particular loneliness Ellen had carried through all of it, or the grief that still lived, unspoken, in the space where a barn used to stand. Grief like that doesn't get undone. It gets carried differently, is all sometimes lighter when you're not carrying it alone. Isaac stayed. That, in the end, is the whole of what mattered most to Ellen, more than any barn, more than any paper filed at the county office. I watched them rebuild that winter, not just the structure, though we raised a new barn by February with lumber Isaac paid for with money he never fully explained the source of, and I chose, for once, not to ask, because a ledger doesn't need every debt accounted for to know a thing's been settled fair. I watched a mother and son rebuild the harder structure between them. The trust 2 years of separate grief had worn thin, board by careful board, the same patient way Isaac had rebuilt his mother's claim to her own land. I still keep my ledger. I'm an old man now, writing this some years on from that autumn, and my hip aches worse than it did then and my hand isn't as steady on the page. But I go back sometimes and read that October entry. The boy came home. I don't know yet if that's good news or the start of worse trouble, and I think about how wrong and how right I turned out to be, both at once, the way life mostly manages to be. There's one more thing I never wrote down, because some things don't belong in a ledger, they belong only in the person who witnessed them. The morning after the barn burned, before either of them knew I was watching, I saw Ellen standing at the edge of the ash, and Isaac came and stood beside her, and neither one said a word for a long while. Then he reached over, careful, like he wasn't sure yet if he'd earned the right, and took her hand. She let him,